Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jonathan Eisler, and I'm the Vice President of Organizational Consulting at Perspectives. We knew that the topic today about whether to require vaccinations or not would be valuable, and we knew it would generate a lot of interest. And based off of the responses that we received to today's session, our assumptions were definitely confirmed. It seems this question has been on the minds of our customers, our clients, partners, and our friends throughout the industry. When preparing the content, we wanted to make sure that we bring you the legal information to consider, as well as our perspective on the mental health impact that we are seeing. We feel it's also important to share some guidance on what you can do for yourself and to support your team members. To get things started, I'm pleased to introduce John Boghossian. We've worked with John and his firm for years, and he's delivered multiple trainings for our team that includes ensuring we're compliant with the Illinois SB 75 law that requires all employers to hold annual anti-harassment trainings. John is one of the founders of FVLD Law. He provides broad representation for clients in the media, in healthcare, food and beverage, hotel sectors, as well as manufacturing and service companies. John has a strong focus on labor and employment. In his practice, he frequently counsels employers on hiring, discipline, and termination issues. However, he is a great believer in taking a proactive and preventative approach. It's another reason that we enjoy working with John and his firm. Today, you'll find his presentation is comprehensive, but we do want to caution that you should always get legal advice for your specific organization, workforce, industry, location, etc. In the meantime, you are going to get a great understanding of all factors that you should be considering as an organization or as an employer. We have a couple of poll questions in today's session that will challenge your thinking. You'll see links to some references in the chat as well you can download. We'd encourage you to grab as much of this as you can. And please note that we will hold questions to the end of the session. After our second speaker, Jody, explores the impact all of this is having on employees' mental health and overall well-being. So use the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen here to pose questions that we will hopefully get to at the end of today's session. But if you also just want to chime in on the conversation, please use the chat feature. We would also recommend, if you go up to the top right-hand corner under view or those three little dots, that you select the speaker view, and then you can really focus on the content as well as seeing the speaker over to the side for whoever's presenting that portion of today's conversation. Lastly, we will be sending out a recording to today's session in a few days. Please reference this, go back, review points that may be especially of importance to you, share it with anyone and everyone in your network that you feel would benefit as well. John, thank you very much for being here. I want to turn it over to you so we can dive into this very important topic.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. I appreciate that kind introduction, and I also appreciate how Perspectives put this wonderful program together and for your kind invitation. As you can see, everybody, our topic is to require vaccination or not to require vaccination. That is the question. And that Hamlet-inspired title of our workshop raises three questions. First, is it permissible for employers to require employees to be vaccinated for COVID-19? Second, if so, what are the limits or pitfalls, if any? And thirdly, what kind of things do we suggest when it comes to, for employers, when it comes to vaccinations? Unfortunately, there are no easy answers with respect to COVID-19. First, the situation is very fluid and eruptive, as we've seen in the news. Second, legal guidelines are still evolving. And third, often determinations need to be made on a case-by-case basis. Now, before we start answering the three questions, I want to note two goals that I have for you. First, I want to make a difference for you, to have you learn some things that can help you in your business, especially with respect to vaccinations. And second, I want you to feel engaged, because when we are engaged, it makes the learning richer and deeper. Now, rather than to deliver a lecture about the law, I like to use scenarios to help explain the law. So I'll be reading each one before we discuss it. And I would ask you to ask yourselves what you think the answer is to the question that each of the scenarios pose. Let's look at scenario number one. An employer concerned for the health and safety of its employees implements a mandatory COVID-19 vaccination policy for all employees. The question is this permissible? Now we have a poll that is launching so that I would appreciate it if you go ahead and vote for what you think is the right answer to that poll. And in a moment, Jonathan will let us know what he is seeing from our audience. For those of you who are answering or have answered the question in your own minds, I ask you, is that your final answer? Okay, so I see we have the results already. If you are right in your answer, I wish I could say that you've won $1 million, but Jonathan said that it's not in the budget. I just don't understand that. But I think you can see what the results were. Jonathan, do you want to just share those results? It was close to 50-50 as I saw.
Yes, so we have 48% said yes, and 52% said no. So yeah, almost split right down the middle.
Sounds close to an election result. At any rate, the answer is yes, subject to certain exceptions. So I think the yeses and the nos kind of have it. I think everybody got the answer right. But why is the answer more yes? Well, most employees are what we call employees at will. And this means that an employer or an employee may end the employment relationship at any time with or without notice or cause. The at-will dynamic means that employers generally have the discretion to set the conditions of employment, and that would include the ability to require employees to be vaccinated. In addition, the EEOC has, with some limits, blessed mandatory vaccinations and issued guidance about this. But let's now examine what some of those limits or exceptions are. Let's look at scenario number 2. An employer adopts a mandatory vaccination policy. An employee advises the employer that she is highly allergic, that for this reason she has never even received a flu shot, and that she could go into anaphylactic shock if she has to receive a COVID-19 vaccination. What should the employer do? Well, the answer is that the employer should engage in something known as the interactive process. What's this all about? Well, the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA, requires an employer to engage in an interactive process when an employee raises a health issue or requests an accommodation. That process requires an employer to dialogue with an employee with a disability to endeavor to reasonably accommodate the employee absent undue hardship. Now, while a vaccination might be optimal for protecting fellow employees, there are likely other ways to protect them. Perhaps the employee can work remotely. If that's not feasible, maybe the employee can wear a mask or other PPE. And the employer can also require employees to socially distance, wash their hands, and work staggered hours. If an employer cannot reasonably accommodate employees without undue hardship, then under the ADA, it can physically exclude from the workplace employees who cannot be vaccinated if they pose a direct threat to the health or safety of individuals in the workplace. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. But first you might ask, well, what's undue hardship? Well, it can entail significant financial difficulty, and it needs to be significant. And it can also entail an unduly extensive, substantial, or disruptive solution. There are a number of factors that are examined when determining whether there's an undue hardship. First, there's the nature and cost of the accommodation, the overall financial resources of the employer, the number of employers the employee has, and the effect of the proposed accommodation on expenses and resources. There's the type of operation the employer has, and then there's the impact of the accommodation. So all those things need to be assessed. Now, you may be surprised what does and does not constitute undue hardship. For example, concern about employee or customer fears or prejudice does not constitute an undue hardship. Likewise, there is no undue hardship due to a concern that there will be a negative impact on employee morale. Therefore, if the employer in scenario 2 were to contend that other employees would be afraid to come to work if the non-vaccinated employee were to work among them, that would not meet the undue hardship test. The point here is that if an employer is inclined to automatically discharge an employee who needs or requests an accommodation because it believes there is an undue hardship or a direct threat, it needs to think twice. The employer needs to assess the situation thoroughly and determine if there are available employee protections under applicable law. Let's take a look at the dramatic example that scenario 3 provides with respect to undue hardship. The telephone operator position at a small service company has only 2 essential functions: to answer the phone and then direct telephone calls to others within the company. Jane, one of the company's operators, is in a terrible car accident and as a result becomes a quadriplegic. After having been on medical leave, Jane seeks to return to work. The company has Jane submit to a fitness for duty evaluation to determine whether she can perform the essential functions of her job with or without a reasonable accommodation. The doctor writes back and concludes that in his professional opinion, Jane cannot perform the essential functions because she is a quadriplegic, and it would be an undue hardship on the company to provide her with appropriate prosthetics due to their prohibitive cost. The question is, if you're the HR director of the company, what do you do? Well, the employer would need to engage in that interactive process we were just talking about. Simply accepting the doctor's determination is not going to cut it. The doctor is not the last word. He's really the first word. And while the doctor has great knowledge about medical conditions, the doctor is not necessarily skilled in the legal requirements of the ADA. Moreover, perhaps the employee has a good suggestion as to how the employer can reasonably accommodate her. So the employer should explore that as part of the interactive process. Now, as it so happens, there is a 10-cent solution here that the doctor has overlooked. Although the employee is a quadriplegic, she can still perform the essential functions of the receptionist position. And you might ask, well, how's that? Well, by having a colleague place the telephone headset on her head and having her colleague place a pencil on an attachment to the headset. All the employee needs to do is to ascertain who a caller wants to speak with, tilt her head forward and use the eraser of the pencil to push a button to connect the caller to the appropriate person or to voicemail. Now let's look at scenario number 4. The owner of a restaurant implements a mandatory vaccination policy. Due to a life-threatening allergy, a line cook at the restaurant is unable to take the vaccine. Following the policy's implementation, the line cook informs the owner that he recently visited family in an area experiencing an uptick in COVID-19 cases. He also lets his manager know that he is experiencing a mild cough and a loss of taste and smell, but that he otherwise feels good and feels good enough to work. How should the employer proceed? Well, the answer is that the employer should eliminate the direct threat. And the employer can do this by making a reasonable accommodation. In this case, it might be to place the employee on a leave of absence for the period recommended by the Center for Disease Control. And you have to remember that at this point, an unvaccinated employee likely does not pose a direct threat without more. First, while vaccines may prevent one from having COVID-19 symptoms, the COVID-19 vaccines have not been widely shown to prevent transmissions. Second, there are other steps besides vaccination that can be taken to prevent transmission, and these include things like wearing a mask, social distancing, and hand washing. Now, it's not easy for an employer to meet the direct threat standard. The test is, does the employee pose a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of the individual or others that cannot be eliminated or reduced by reasonable accommodation? In making the direct threat assessment, an employer has to make an objective rather than a subjective assessment. And the assessment has to be based on current medical knowledge, not old data. And the employer needs to consider, among other things, the following factors: the duration of the risk, the nature and severity of the potential harm, the likelihood of the harm, and the imminence of the harm. Now, we need to talk about medical exams for a moment. The ADA places limits on an employer's ability to conduct medical exams or inquire about disabilities. There is an exception if the exam is job-related and consistent with business necessity. However, this is the exception, not the rule. Now, you might be asking, well, what does the restriction on medical exams have to do with vaccinations? Well, if an employer administers vaccines, it could learn information about an employee's disability in the course of asking questions of the employee in connection with the vaccination. Therefore, we recommend that an employer not administer the vaccines itself. Instead, we think that an employer should suggest the employee use a third party, and that the employer should not contract with the third party for this purpose. For example, the employer might suggest that employees go to their preferred clinic, pharmacy, or hospital to receive a vaccination. And by making a referral, an employer should not be liable for pre-vaccination questions that may elicit medical information about an employee. Now let's switch gears a little bit. Let's look at scenario number 5. After an employer adopts a mandatory vaccination policy, an employee who is a Christian Scientist tells the employer that it is against her religion to be vaccinated. What should the employer do? The employer should verify the sincerity of the employee's religious belief. The question is why? And the answer is that under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, employees on notice of an employee's sincerely held religious beliefs that prevent the employee from receiving a vaccination are required to provide a reasonable accommodation, absent undue hardship. Those accommodations could include things such as working remotely. If that's not possible, the employee could wear a mask or other PPE, or there could be plastic dividers that might help. The employer could also require the employees to socially distance, wash hands, and to work staggered hours. Now, if a reasonable accommodation is not possible, an employer may physically exclude the employee from the workplace if the employee poses a direct threat to the health or safety of individuals in the workplace. This does not mean that an employer may automatically terminate the employee's employment. An employer is still going to need to determine whether the employee has any additional protections under EEO laws or other federal, state, and local laws or regulations. Now let's look at scenario number 6, which is similar to the one we just discussed. After an employer adopts a mandatory vaccination policy, an employee who is a known atheist and who never attends a house of worship tells his employer it is against his religion to be vaccinated, and he requests to be excused from being vaccinated. What should the employer do? Well, the answer again is that the employer needs to verify the sincerity of the religious belief. And here the employer should try to ascertain the objective basis for the belief. And this may entail requesting or seeking evidence. Since the employee is a known atheist, he does not believe in God, he does not attend a house of worship, and there was no widely known precept that atheists should not be vaccinated, the employer likely would not have to grant the employee's request to be excused from being vaccinated, but the employer still needs to go through the process. Now let's look at scenario number 7. To protect patients and fellow workers, a hospital requires that all of its employees be vaccinated. A nurse caring for COVID-19 patients asserts that she will not comply because she does not trust the available vaccines and thinks they were developed too quickly. What should the employer do here? Well, the employer should have a discussion with the employee about her options. The employer should point out that the employee's distrust of the vaccine is not a protected category, and that the employer has the right to require her to receive a vaccination. The employer may also want to outline some of the benefits of being vaccinated. If the employee still refuses, then the employer is in the difficult position of either adhering to its mandatory vaccination policy or departing from it. And if it departs, that could lead to discrimination claims or morale issues with respect to other employees. Therefore, an employer may want to think twice about requiring vaccinations, and if it does require them, whether it will depart from its policy. Now let's move over to the union side of things. A non-union employer implements a mandatory vaccination policy. A small group of employees descends on the office of the president to let her know that they do not feel the vaccines are safe and that they object to the policy. The president fires the non-union employees on the spot for insubordination. Well, here's another poll for you. The question is, was the president within her rights to discharge the employees? You got a poll going? Yep, there we go. Give you another few seconds to answer that question, and then we can see how the audience has done on this question. We got some poll results. Yep. Okay. Boy, it's 41% yes and 59% no. Well, let's take a look at the answer. No, the president was not within her rights. And this is because the National Labor Relations Act protects employees and allows them to engage in what is known as protected concerted activity regarding terms and conditions of employment. Firing employees for exercising their rights is an unfair labor practice. Now, by the way, although the act largely deals with unionized employee rights, the concerted activity protection extends to a group of employees or an employee who is acting on behalf of a group of employees with respect to terms and conditions of employment. It's therefore irrelevant that the employees are not members of a union in this scenario. Let's look at the last scenario, number 9. A union employer implements a mandatory vaccination policy without discussing it with the union. The union objects and demands that the employer bargain with the union about the policy. The employer refuses. The union files an unfair labor practice charge against the employer. Who will prevail and why? Well, the answer is the union will prevail, unless the collective bargaining agreement grants the employer the right to require employees to receive vaccinations. The reason is that under the National Labor Relations Act, an employer has a duty to bargain with the union about terms and conditions of employment. By unilaterally implementing the mandatory vaccination policy, the employer bypassed the union, which is an unfair labor practice. We're now going to discuss some pitfalls of mandatory vaccinations.
John.
Yes.
Real quick, and I know that we were saving questions for the end, but there is one, someone just looking for some clarity here. Maybe we can jump in on this real quick.
Sure.
So based off of the response there, or the correct answer, the comment or question is, so the president could fire one person not in agreement with taking the vaccine, but not a group of employees, or on a concerted activity platform, in parentheses?
Yes, unless the employee is speaking on behalf of a group of employees, if it's just himself or herself, that is not protected under the National Labor Relations Act. It's got to be concerted activity, and concerted activity is more than one, or one speaking on behalf of many. So if the person phrases it that I and others don't want it, then there can be protection there.
Got it. Thank you for clarifying.
Okay, my pleasure. Good question. So let's talk about those potential side effects of vaccines resulting in pitfalls for employers. The vaccines were developed in record time, as you'll recall, so there's still a lot that we don't know about them. And unforeseen side effects or even death could result. If there are side effects, employees could file workers' compensation claims against their employers for not being required to be vaccinated. This actually can give employers some protection against lawsuits because with respect to workers' comp claims, they are usually an employee's only avenue for relief. And the claim would be resolved before a hearing officer rather than a jury of one's peers that could award a large judgment against an employer. Nevertheless, creative employees and their even more creative lawyers might try to file suit in court, where the stakes could be greater and where certainly the cost of defending the case are likely to be more expensive. Another consequence of requiring vaccinations could be employee anger and hostility. Some employees can be resistant or become upset whenever an employer tells them to do something. Their defiance can be akin to oppositional defiant disorder, which is most prevalent in children. The news has abounded with stories about people who are rebelling against wearing masks. They feel it deprives them of freedom of choice. They may feel even more fervently about mandatory vaccinations. And finally, anger and hostility can lead to issues with employee morale and productivity, and perhaps even workplace violence. Now, interestingly, if an employer does not mandate employee vaccinations, some employees may try to pursue their employer for not requiring them. They might do so by claiming that their employer has not provided them with a safe and healthy working environment as required by the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Now, whether such a claim would succeed remains to be seen because it would be breaking new ground. Moreover, an employer could argue that vaccinations are not the only way to protect employees. Nevertheless, if conditions become so unsafe, it would not be surprising if such lawsuits were to be filed. We have some suggestions as to how employers might want to proceed, and there's not one right way to go for the reasons we've already discussed. But we suggest that an employer recommend that employees obtain vaccines rather than require them. We also suggest that employers educate employees about the potential benefits of vaccines. That may encourage them to get vaccinations. Like Dollar General and some other companies, employers may also want to consider offering incentives such as gift cards or time off. Employers, however, would be wise to keep these incentives at a modest level, lest they be deemed to be offering a wellness plan or being accused of discrimination. And to engage employees, employers may want to ask their employees for their ideas about how to maintain a safe working environment. You know, sometimes employees have the best ideas. Now we're going to look at some additional concrete steps that employers may want to take. We think that an employer should prepare a vaccination policy. It's important for an employer to communicate with employees its position with respect to vaccinations, whatever that may be. Let them know whether vaccinations are required or recommended. The policy should outline the circumstances under which the employer will offer a reasonable accommodation, such as for disabilities and sincere religious beliefs that would prevent them from being vaccinated. And the policy should also specify the consequences for non-compliance, including reserving the right to discipline or discharge employees. In addition, after consultation with one's lawyer, an employer may want to consider including disclaimers or releases that employees are taking vaccines at their own risk. Of course, this could discourage some employees from taking them, and the disclaimer or release may not be enforceable as a matter of public policy. An employer needs to be prepared to offer reasonable accommodations if employees do not want to receive vaccines. So I would suggest that you anticipate the kinds of requests that you think you'll receive. Try to determine in advance what accommodations you think will work well for your organization and for your employees. And we've talked about some of those, like PPE, leave of absence, working remotely. It's very important to train managers and supervisors about how to deal with employees with respect to COVID and vaccinations. You'll want to educate them about the requirements of the ADA and Title VII and the importance of the interactive process. You'll also want to be sure that they understand your organization may be required to offer employees reasonable accommodation and share suggestions of what would constitute a reasonable accommodation. You also need to impress upon managers and supervisors that the ADA has certain privacy and confidentiality obligations. Now, while an employer may inquire whether an employee has been vaccinated, it shouldn't be requesting or receiving other medical information about an employee, absent a business necessity. And to the extent an employer learns of confidential medical information about an employee, it should be kept confidential. It's also critical that managers and supervisors not retaliate against employees for exercising their legal rights. Sometimes employers win the discrimination case, but they lose the retaliation case. And finally, to ensure consistent administration of your policy, make sure that they coordinate with HR before taking action with respect to employees. Now, when your organization makes decisions about employees, especially disciplinary ones, it's critical to document them. In this way, if necessary, you can establish that you made a rational, non-discriminatory, and non-retaliatory decision. In addition, if your organization reasonably accommodates an employee's disability or religious belief, it would be wise to discreetly document that accommodation. Now, as I wind up my portion of the program, let's recap what we've covered. With limited exceptions, employers may require employees to receive vaccinations. It's important to try to reasonably accommodate employees with disabilities and to engage in that interactive process with them. Don't assume that there will be undue hardship or a direct threat. Review the situation carefully, as we saw in that scenario dealing with the paraplegic individual. Verify and reasonably accommodate sincere religious beliefs of employees who claim that receiving a vaccine would be contrary to the principles of their religion. If your organization has a union and you want to require employees to be vaccinated, check your contract to verify whether it allows you to do so. And if it doesn't, you probably need to engage in bargaining with the union about that. And whether or not your organization has a union, if employees protest terms and conditions of employment under the National Labor Relations Act, don't fire them for that. It could be an unfair labor practice. And again, avoid learning confidential medical information about employees, and don't have your organization administer vaccines to employees. Have them go to a third party of their choice. You'll need to decide whether you want to recommend or require vaccinations. That's probably going to be your biggest decision. And if you recommend them, educate employees and consider offering modest incentives for those employees who get vaccinated. And also consider soliciting employee ideas for workplace COVID safety. Prepare a vaccination policy so that you communicate effectively with your employees and let them know what to expect. Anticipate the kind of reasonable accommodations you'll have to make and be ready to do so. And finally, be sure to well-train managers and supervisors. They're your front line. They're the ones who are going to be interacting with your employees. Now, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this important topic with you today. I hope that you've received value from the discussion and that you were engaged. I want to leave you with this final thought. They say that there are three kinds of people in the world. There are those who make things happen. There are those who watch things happen. And there are those who wonder, what happened? And I hope that through Jody Elliott's and my remarks today, you'll know how to make things happen for your organization with respect to employees and vaccinations. Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to turn things back over to Jonathan so that he can introduce Jody.
Wow, John, that was a lot of information, but I think I speak not only for myself, but hopefully for the rest of our attendees today, that the scenarios that you shared really made it a lot easier to understand, right? And I think this is even reinforced further when we get to the questions that we'll get to at the end of today's session, just because the scenarios where it seems are really bringing some very, very specific detailed questions to mind. So again, thank you for sharing the scenarios and really taking everything that you've talked about down into the real world that all of us as employers are facing today. So let's get to our second speaker. While everyone else keeps thinking of these great questions, please keep them coming in. As a reminder, send the questions through the Q&A. It's a lot easier for us to be able to track them that way versus through the chat feature. And again, as a reminder, we will be sending around a recording to today's session. It won't include the actual PowerPoint file, but you will see all the slides in the recording. We will also make sure that the links to all the resources that we have shared in the chat feature, those are included as well. And as I mentioned, you should be getting these within a few days. So turn it over to Jody now. Jody's the clinical supervisor here at Perspectives, where she leads our clinical team and she coordinates training. Jody helps oversee counseling that is provided to medical, nursing, and graduate students for a health sciences campus here in Chicago. She also oversees a wellness assessment program and manages Perspective's critical incident response team, who supports organizations around emergency needs and crisis. Jody, I'd like to turn it over to you now.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. In just one moment here, we can go ahead and get started. It's a pleasure to be with everyone here today. And thanks so much, John, as well. There's definitely a lot of value, and thanks for those scenarios too. In just a moment here, let's see. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my start page. Great. As we continue our conversation today about vaccine hesitancy, I thought it would be important for us to take a quick detour so we can discuss the importance and the relevance about our employees' mental health today. Why, you might be asking? Because mental health issues have been trending up in the past year in this era of our new normal. You'll hear about more about that in a moment. We'll start with mental health because staying attuned to this reality provides us with important context, and it reminds us how many people are being faced with it right now. With that, we're being tasked with making many important life decisions for ourselves, families, and these are decisions that include such as whether or not to get vaccinated. And we'll certainly be delving into more of that in a couple of moments. So let's get started with mental health. We'll go ahead and begin by taking a look at some of the most prevalent mental health themes of the pandemic, particularly ones that we're seeing. The first, burnout, is a phenomenon that applied even before the pandemic, particularly among healthcare workers and first responders. However, it's even more pronounced during the pandemic. This is true across the board for nearly all essential workers. We rightly recognize them as heroes of the pandemic, not only because of what they're being asked to do, but the conditions that they've had to do it under. And of course, one doesn't need to be a hero to contend with burnout. If you have employees with more everyday type jobs, they're hitting a pandemic wall. And when you aren't seeing employees face to face, as many of you may not be, the burnout as well as other stressors, it can be hard to detect. So let's go into depression and anxiety. These are two areas where at Perspectives, we've really been seeing a dramatic increase with our client base. In 1 year, with depression, we've seen an 11% increase, and anxiety a whopping 25% increase. Again, over a year. We probably all know people who are happy to stay home a lot, right? It's been just fine. And I'll go over some statistics related to that when I cover adjustments to the pandemic. But staying home could mean no more commute or less of a commute. It could mean increased time with family. That's certainly a positive. However, there's a lot of people, 28% of Americans, who actually live alone. So for them, things might not be as positive. There's certainly less of support, more isolation. Times are just tough. And in a few moments, again, we'll see how depression and anxiety can be correlated with decision-making, and particularly today we're talking about how to choose what we're going to do about the vaccine. We've also seen an uptick with people calling regarding their finances, major financial issues because, for example, many people have lost income in their families. If it's a two-partner family, a lot of people have lost significant income. They've also had to just worry about how are we going to meet these childcare costs that we're facing, or how are we going to pay bills by the end of the month? Also in our call center, there's been a significant increase of domestic violence calls. Whereas before the pandemic, we may get about 3 to 4 calls per month. There have been stretches as recently as January where we were getting 3 to 4 calls in 1 week. This pandemic has also led to declines in physical health. People are exercising less, snacking more. They're putting off elective procedures, and they're just not choosing as healthy of options. Like many of us may know or recall what a freshman experience might be from college, what a freshman 15 was. You've probably heard that there's a term coined quarantine 15. I know we've talked to, we recently were talking to a primary care physician who had mentioned to us in his practice, in 3 months, he had seen 60% of his population, of his patient population, gain 20% more weight than the last time he had met with them. So, you know, this might ring true to you or to people that you know, but health and health choices are certainly making a difference. What else creates stress? Well, change. Any change in routine, even positive, requires adjustment and it adds stress. And of course, during COVID, change has been the name of the game. So today we'll look at 2 types of adjustments, starting with changes employees have had to make, and we'll end with changes employers have made organizationally. Starting with employees, the most obvious change for many has been working from home. This has been positive, again, but not so positive for all. There's also been learning curves. There's also been people just not used to Teams or not used to digital support technologies. We've seen that, and we've all been in meetings where, Nancy, you're still on mute. Nancy, I don't know about you, but I've certainly been Nancy before. So while the ideal setup for remote work is spacious and it can be private, nice home office, complete with the latest technology and screens, well, the truth is many Americans are sharing the couch or their breakfast table with their family. I don't know about you, but I have certainly met people who have told me they have had to go to the car to get on Zoom and log on to a presentation or a meeting, something that they couldn't miss, button up, coat, hat, freezing, but you got to do what you got to do. For employees whose jobs do not permit working remotely, essential workers, for example, adjustments have been less about space and more about hours. Longer shifts and irregular schedules have been commonplace. These same employees may also have added health risks by working in close proximity to one another. For example, early in the pandemic, we saw some of the highest positivity rates for COVID were among healthcare workers. What about employers? Let's take a look. How's that been different? Organizationally, you've also had to adapt and find a way to stay on course. For many businesses, the first question was, can we even make it? Restaurants are a classic example. With in-person seating greatly reduced or even eliminated, nearly all businesses had to shift to pickup or delivery. And for employers, the shift to virtual didn't simply mean learning Zoom. It meant just having to get creative about figuring out how to communicate with one another. On the HR side, more requests were made for family or medical leave and challenges in hiring and onboarding new employees from afar. While many employees claimed they were more productive working from home, employers didn't always see those results. Ultimately, all of this meant that company culture, something notoriously persistent during normal times, could no longer be taken for granted. Without daily interactions that tended to reinforce culture, organizations were having to be proactive. As an example, at Perspectives, we have a culture committee that does a great job and has chosen the right people who can just find the most creative ways for us to come together as an organization. So we've discussed mental health implications and additional stressors, adjustments as well. All this is now leading to our new normal. When reflecting on these times and reflecting on this new normal, we've seen that countless adjustments have been made. Early on, there was likely an assumption that everyone will return to normalcy as soon as possible. Instead, what a lot of organizations are finding is that some of the changes may be worth hanging on to. We've seen people warm up to the fact that constant change is actually what's defining the workplace today. Many more leaders, managers have been more flexible, patient, and understanding, and higher empathy as well. This is very appreciated among employees and employers. Employees appreciate when their managers can at least have a soft side for what they're dealing with at home. It does go a long way. Again, positives we're seeing here as well, growth opportunities. We've spoken recently to a Chicago-based healthcare organization, and they saw attendance at their annual conference grow from 400 people to 2,000 people, again, in 1 year. So, as a result, they're going to keep doing their conference that way because they're reaching that many more people. Of course, one aspect of the new normal involves getting back to work and doing that safely. And this is where employee attitudes and employer policies play a major role regarding the vaccine. What we're about to look at is the topic of vaccine hesitancy, but I hope the material that I've gone over so far has provided you with some necessary context to examine this issue. Vaccine hesitancy. Let's first start off by talking about why does it matter? And again, what is it? It is a reluctance or refusal to be vaccinated or to have one's child vaccinated. It's also been identified by the World Health Organization as one of the top 10 threats to global health. We're all familiar with Dr. Fauci, and as he tells us, there needs to be 75 to 85% of Americans to get vaccinated for us to even return to normal. What this bar graph here illustrates, this was done by the Kaiser Family Foundation, it's illustrating that this is constantly evolving, and some may interpret this as good news. You look at in December, there were 34% of people who said, I'll go ahead and get the vaccine as soon as possible, as soon as I can. In just 1 month, that rose to 41%. So again, this is constantly evolving. So with this rapid pace, we do want to remember that there's a lot of reasons that people might be hesitant about vaccines. There's a lot that contributes to why people are worried and why people are actually worried about vaccines. You'll see some of them here. Misinformation. Did you know that as many as 54% of Americans say that they get their news through social media, either often or sometimes? Again, 54% of Americans. That was seen with Pew Research. I don't know about you, but I also get my news sometimes from social media. Why? It's really accessible. I know during commutes, we can take care of that. We can get as much news as possible, online, and even sometimes through social media. By the time we get home, we don't have to watch the news because we already have a lot of information. Where it can get a little dicey is people pay a lot of attention to the comment section, and that is where, the rumor mills can get started. Nothing's fact checked, and there's just a lot of conspiracy theories. With conspiracy theories, they're really provocative, they grab your attention, and they might make one really eager to learn more and to hear more about it. So information, but also fear and distrust. Fear and distrust are major factors that contribute to vaccine hesitancy. The name warp speed that was applied to the development and the deployment of vaccine was supposed to speak to its urgency. However, many Americans hear the name and wonder if things were too rushed. Were corners cut? Were important safety concerns ignored? According to Dr. Sharon Mazumber, an infectious disease specialist in Memphis, the warp speed name indeed contributes to a lack of confidence and perhaps reminds the public that long-term side effects of the vaccine may not be known. Add to this fact, we're living in a culture where the consensus opinion of medical experts is outweighed maybe by their cousin Carl or an anonymous poster on a Reddit forum. I know in our work with medical students, healthcare students, we hear about Reddit all the time. People are going to Reddit all the time. And even though these are really bright people, there's important information on Reddit, in their opinion, that can help them guide themselves to make decisions. Two demographics where distrust is particularly high are in couples expecting or planning to conceive and in the African American community. There are always questions about how treatments can impact fertility or an unborn fetus, and these standard questions apply to the various COVID vaccines. Regarding African Americans, there is a tragic but real history of mistreatment that still scars the present day. A classic example is this Tuskegee syphilis study, which went on all the way to the 1970s. Much more pronounced than with earlier pandemics, we'll see that identity is playing a critical role. People are certainly proud of who they are and what groups that they are affiliated with. We definitely see that with religion. There's a lot of different faiths out there that have really strong beliefs. And some of them might include avoidance of anything medical, any medical treatments, any medications, any vaccines. Others might worry that there could be pork products in the vaccine, shellfish, maybe people have an allergic reaction, like John had talked about. There's serious issues that come into play. Politics as well. I know with a lot of the clients we speak with, it's definitely not uncommon for them to mention their political ties and affiliation when talking about the vaccine. In a September 2020 poll conducted by Morning Consult, 28% of respondents said they believe the vaccines are politically influenced. This can be really polarizing. People are also just really unsure, they're stuck, they're feeling complacent. Some thoughts might include, well, I'm pretty young still, or I'm healthy, I haven't had anything to worry about. I don't typically get the flu shot, so why do I need to get, this vaccine? Maybe people in my bubble aren't getting vaccinated yet. What's the hurry? Well, one way to look at it is that if everyone starts thinking that way, then no one's going to vaccinate. Already with COVID-19, people think, oh, well, if I had it, I can't get it again. Well, we know that to be untrue. People think I'll wait for my elder neighbors to go. The thing is, there's already been scores of people who've gotten vaccinated. Time, again, it's rapidly changing. And so now 33 million Americans have received their first dose and 10 million are waiting on their second dose. So this is at this point is 1 in 10 Americans. What about access? Some neighborhoods or communities will see fewer locations, longer lines, and economic barriers to vaccination. Many people who want the vaccine will find it difficult to obtain. The medical setting some folks may need to report to could be too far. Maybe they don't have transportation. Maybe they don't have a relative that can take off work to help them get transportation. It's the winter as well, so maybe they typically wouldn't mind walking, but even if it's to the bus stop, but now they're going to think twice. Well, as the vaccine rollout continues and your policies are established, you may see low vaccination numbers among some of your employees. But rather than assume greater hesitancy, it's important to access and see if you can actually do things as an organization to broaden access. In this environment, what are some things that you as employers could do to make a difference? While the attitudes and beliefs of many employees may be hard to change, there are still ways employers can increase the success of their vaccination policies. As with most things, communication is key. Let your employers know where you are and where you're planning to go. When you can, involve employees in the process, solicit input, listen to concerns. Community leaders are also really important allies to you. In some cases, this might include medical experts sharing facts and debunking myths. In other cases, these might be simply trusted folks from your community, respected leaders from other backgrounds. These could be religious leaders, business owners, even popular athletes. Regarding communication, there's a very specific method that might be worth hearing more about. Motivational interviewing. Well, motivational interviewing is a guided style of communication developed in part by clinical psychologists William Miller and Stephen Rolnick. This was back in the 80s. It's direct and person-centered, and it's aimed at eliciting change, or at least changing it how you go about thinking about decisions. It's evidence-based, and initially it was designed to help the demographic. The first demographic was problem drinkers, but over the years it's evolved, and it's been used to work with people who are considering quitting smoking, wanting to exercise more, or just making important life decisions. You'll notice that positivepsychology.com, it has a nice, it spells it out nicely, kind of simply about how you might be able to use it, even as an employer, a supervisor, or manager. It's really about asking open-ended questions, reflecting back. Some of you might already be doing this and not even realizing it. And here's now a frame for it. It's about eliciting pros and cons and really doing a values assessment with your employees. What's really important to them? What might be some barriers or some stepping stones? So it's very collaborative. It's a dialogue. It's not at all meant to be, coercive. It's really just about a conversation. And finally, you'll just summarize what you heard, and a person is left kind of able to think about things in a new way. As you heard John mention, some organizations are in fact incentivizing. They are rewarding healthy behaviors, and incentives can definitely make a difference in motivating employees, especially the ones on the fence. Common examples include a gift card or additional time off. Employees may not want to burn off a sick day right now, though, to get their COVID shot, but the situation changes if time away from work doesn't come out of their sick time. That's just one example. That said, there's a risk of overdoing incentives. When they're too large, they can actually increase distrust. A common employee reaction to something like a $500 incentive might be, gosh, what do I not know about this vaccine that I have to get paid this much for it? There can be a sense of coercion when employees who genuinely don't want the vaccine feel like they have to get it simply because they need money so badly. Of course, what you do always is more important than what you say. As leaders in your organization, it really starts with you. If you're promoting a vaccine among your employees, it'll really help if you have vaccinated yourself to let people know about it. An honest accounting is better than sugarcoating the experience. For example, it's totally okay to say, yeah, I was kind of feeling a little out of it for an hour after, or my arm did hurt on the way home. Or even, I kind of was on the fence about it for a month or so. I needed more information to come out. We really want to normalize people's responses no matter where they sit. These kinds of stories can help replace employee fear of the worst case scenarios with the actual experiences of people that they trust. If you have other employees that many in your organization look up to, which I'm sure you do, see if they'd be willing to share their experiences. In many organizations, the influencers can be found throughout the org chart and not just at the top. And for your employees who are simply looking for more facts, there are some great resources to know about. Let's take a look. So there are a plethora of resources out there, and I just grabbed a few for today. In the top, we started with University of Chicago Medicine, and we know University of Chicago Medicine is a worldwide prestigious institution that is basically one that we can trust. We've worked with them closely, but we also know, that this is where a lot of people are doing great research, and so the facts are there. So there actually is one called What to Know About the COVID-19 Vaccine, and on this link, basically, it'll tell you pretty much everything about, what the studies entailed and the reasons why people were not getting the vaccine and how that's changing. Also, how certain groups were really and have been really afraid about getting the vaccine, such as pregnant women. It might also direct you to a link. It does direct you to a link to the OB-GYN site, and they can go into, the safety considerations of the vaccine as it pertains to pregnancy and fertility. The Centers for Disease Control also has toolkits for communication. Check these out as well, because they have a lot of different industries represented. So you might find some that kind of hit home a little bit more. Of course, employee assistance programs. This is definitely not a time to go through all of these huge experiences and huge decisions alone. We're seeing now more than ever people wanting to partner with us because they know that they can trust on us, whether it's coming to their organization and being in a webinar to talk about whether it's grief as it pertains to COVID, or whether it's burnout as it pertains to those in healthcare. We are there for you, and we know that our employee base who counts on us, they tell us, employers tell us, leaders tell us, thank you so much. I don't think we had the tools to do this ourselves. With the organizational consulting that Jonathan's group is doing, all across the board, our clinical team, we're seeing that we're able to reach a lot of people right now. We really are, and we're really lucky to be able to do so. And so if you haven't partnered up with an EAP yet, this is a time to give more thought to that. So speaking of, our resource page is also excellent. I know our marketing team does a phenomenal job of pretty much everything is very current, very up to date, whether it's about, the vaccine or COVID or election, anything that could impact your employees, check it out. But also, you might be logging in today from other states, from Iowa, from New Hampshire, from Indiana. Definitely use information and use resources that speak to your stakeholders and your employees. People want to hear familiar, like what's familiar. So for example, maybe in Indiana, there's a hospital there that is also doing really good research and has good resources on their site. People want to know, what are the hospitals in our community doing? What are they saying? Kind of like people want to hear from people in the community, people that look like them or people that are in the same age group. So definitely when reaching out and when delivering resources, think about your audience, think about who you're trying to reach and who can do so most effectively. Well, here we are at the end, and you might still be wondering, what do we do? How can you ensure a safe workplace while accommodating the beliefs and desires of all involved? Well, the answer is, unfortunately, you can't. Requiring a vaccine will make some employees unhappy. Meanwhile, not requiring the vaccine will make other employees unhappy. As you navigate the trade-offs involved, about the best you can do is really be honest and transparent with employees, and ideally tie your policies or your recommendations to the values of your organization and circumstances of what's specific to you. As John discussed, requirements for vaccination will need to be accompanied by reasonable accommodations for some employees. Of course, a safe workplace requires that the accommodation not simply be, okay, well then don't get vaccinated. Recall that masks, social distancing, or remaining remote may be required to offset safety risk. It's said often that you can't let perfect get in the way of good. I believe that it applies to vaccinations as much as anything else. Consider the factors most important to your organization. Share the rationales behind your decisions and ensure your employees are supported throughout. Your employees, after all, are your most important resource in sickness and in health. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jody. That was a lot. Thanks for bringing that, the real world examples and the stories about how the pandemic is impacting the mental health for our customer organizations, for their employees, for their families, etc. And I think I can speak for all of us that our hope is that both on the legal side and also the mental health side, that the insights that have been shared today will provide some very tangible, tactical things that everybody can start doing even this afternoon, right, as we sign off today, but also that it invokes more questions, right? We're here as a resource for everybody too, so we would welcome the opportunity to hear from you. Speaking of being here as a resource, we got a lot of great questions that came in. which again, to me, speaks to the importance of today's topic. So we have about 18 minutes left, let's call it. So I would like to just go through, let me make my screen a little bit bigger here. I have pulled all the questions that have come into the Q&A. Oh, we got one more that just came in as well. And any that we actually don't get to this afternoon, we will work on, when we send out the recording to today's session along with the resources, we'll work on getting responses to the questions that we aren't able to address today. So with that said, I'm going to open Jody and John. I think by the nature of some of the questions, we'll be able to figure out who this one is more best appropriate for. But if there is a question that both of you would like to chime in on too, I'd welcome that, as I know our audience would. So let's start with this question. Can we survey employees on whether they are interested in taking the vaccine, or more importantly, have taken it, if it is a confidential survey and we don't ask for more detail? Is this legal? I think we know who this question's for.
Yes, you can survey your employees. In addition, an employer actually can require proof that an employee has been vaccinated. The EEOC has approved that and has said that they don't constitute medical exams under the ADA. Nevertheless, you want to be careful here because you could get into an inquiry that triggers the ADA's limits on disability-related inquiries. So you don't want to go beyond the vaccination if you're going to make an inquiry. But yes, you could do a generalized one that's anonymous. That might actually, from a morale standpoint, go over better with employees, but you can actually ask them.
Thank you, John. That actually addressed another question that had come up somewhere else. So you got two knocked out with that one. Sure. Can we have people who don't choose to be vaccinated sign a waiver releasing any liability against the organization?
Well, I guess I'll take a crack at that. I think that's a legal question more than it is mental health, although it could be both. We're in a gray area right now. You can try waivers, but there's some doubt whether they'll be enforceable. For example, because there's unequal bargaining power between an employer and an employee, a court might find the waiver unenforceable. And some courts won't enforce what's called a prospective waiver. They'll let you waive something in the past, but they won't let you waive something in the future. And courts generally won't protect employers from their gross negligence or reckless or willful conduct. And there's also the problem of you can't override the workers' compensation statutes with a waiver, and you can't prevent the Occupational Safety and Health Administration from coming into your organization. But some employers may still want to have employees sign waivers so that they at least have a potential defense to waive a piece of paper, to try and fend off claims. But you have to weigh that against the impact on employee morale if you require employees to sign them. So I hope that helps, Jonathan.
It does. Thank you, John. That's a perfect lead into the next question too that came in. And Jody, I think this one's going to be more targeted for you. So for employees who oppose the policy to vaccinate, how would their morale be affected? And is it likely that the impact will be short or long term?
Thanks, Jonathan. That is a really good question. Well, with any decision, things are always going to be open to interpretation from a lot of different people, from a lot of walks of life who think a lot of different ways. So I think there's going to be some more impact on morale, but we don't necessarily really see that as long-term, because just the way things are moving so quickly, so many people are getting vaccinated that if there's still groups of people that have chosen not to, we want to respect that, but we also want to trust that we're moving in the right direction. And any issues about safety that I may have, definitely talk to your leaders of your organization.
Great advice. I like that. Thank you. This question came in and asked a few different ways, but around something very similar, around the same topic. how do you verify religious sincerity to warrant exemption from a mandatory vaccination as an employer?
Okay. Well, it may or may not be obvious. For example, in scenario 5, the employee was a known Christian Scientist, and one of the tenets of that religion is to rely on prayer for healing as opposed to, say, vaccines. So I think you can almost take, well, I guess you'd call judicial notice. It's just so widely known. But if an employee is claiming that a religion you've never heard of, prohibits vaccination, or perhaps if they're, an atheist, and you doubt that their religion or their beliefs require or encourage their constituents to avoid vaccinations, then you're going to want to verify the claim. There could be publicly available literature or articles about the subject. I mean, there's so much available today online. You may know of a religious figure in the community who could verify this for you. And you may also want to ask the employee in question to provide you with information to substantiate the basis for the claim. Where is it written that you don't have to get vaccinations? You can certainly ask that question.
So if I'm hearing right, it's more so about validating that it's tied to the religion or whatnot that the employee themselves is saying that is keeping them from it, versus less about them truly being a follower of said religion. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, it's whether they have a sincere religious belief, and if the religion doesn't embrace the idea, it's a little hard to say it's a religious belief. It's probably more of a personal belief. That makes sense?
It does. Thank you. All right. This can be a sticky one here. If an employer requires the vaccine and the employee or an employee has a reaction to the vaccine, what is the employer's responsibility to that employee and missed time due to the reaction or illness that they experienced as a result of the required vaccination?
Great question, as all these questions have been, Jonathan. In most states, workers' compensation laws would control and limit claims against an employer for alleged, misconduct in connection with required vaccinations, because remember I talked when we were covering, I think one of the scenarios, or actually when I was just discussing this point in general, workers' comp laws do protect employers, so they don't have to go to court on these things generally and face wild juries. Now, even if a vaccination injury claim is not considered to be covered under workers' comp laws for some reason, an employee is still going to have to show that its employer was negligent. So if an employer is encouraging or requiring employees to get FDA-approved vaccinations, it's pretty hard to say that the employer was negligent unless they knew there was some fly-by-night placed and they were sending them there. Then maybe I could see liability. In addition, if approved vaccinations are administered by a third party rather than the employer, it's going to be difficult for me to see how an employee could show negligence. Now, in terms of the part of the question about missing time due to the reaction, I think that just pretty much falls under your sick policies, your leave policies, and I think those would just kick in. There are some ordinances in some jurisdictions or statutes where employers have to give sick leave, but generally I would think it would fall under your policy.
Helpful. How can I expect the levels of anxiety and depression among employees to change as the percentage of who are vaccinated changes? So as more and more people are vaccinated with that herd immunity, I think is a term earlier that was used, how can we expect levels of anxiety and depression to change? I think this is for Jody.
Sure, yes. So what we've seen in our worker perspectives is that with our 25% increase, with that uptick of callers that are basically calling because they're anxious, one of the top things that they're anxious about is the time we're living in, including COVID, including vaccine. When people feel safer, they feel less worried. But also, We know this from this is evidence-based. If you talk about, addiction field or with eating disorders, process addictions, the number one recommendation for people who have relapsed or who are struggling with either of these disorders or again with depression and anxiety is community, fostering community. So the more people that do get vaccinated and that when we are able to go back, we expect people's sense of community to really do increase significantly. And we do anticipate that people will be able to count on that and count on that, context and community base for a lot of their support that's been missing.
Many shoulders make the burden lighter.
Exactly.
Right? Thank you. So this question is asking, I'm just going to read it the way that it was asked. I think that there's actually a few different pieces, John, that you may want to pick apart within here because it's asking a really important question. How can we communicate that refusing a vaccine does not exempt employees from returning to work as the city and society opens back up? Again, there's some assumptions in here, so
read that again.
Take it apart as you will, John. How do we communicate that refusing a vaccine does not exempt employees from returning to work as the city opens back up?
Okay. I think, first of all, you want to be transparent and candid with employees. And I think, much like we talked about earlier, an employer has a right to require employees to get vaccinated if that's its policy. And I think the employer can say, look, we have a right to require you to do so, absent a disability or a need for a religious accommodation. And we're going to stick by that policy. Now, if there's a way to maybe reasonably accommodate it, you may get into a discussion. Maybe there's a very good reason that they feel they shouldn't come back. Well, then the question is can they do the work remotely? Can they do it in other ways that are safe? And I just think it's a dialogue that's really important here, rather than just, this down, this is the way it's going to be, the Nikita Khrushchev, shoe on the table kind of approach. That's more from a human resources perspective than it is from a legal perspective. But I think you'll catch more flies with honey than you will with vinegar.
Well said. All right, so we have time. Let's do one more question here. There's a couple of questions that we won't have time to get to. One of them is much more appropriate for someone in the medical and the research field. So, but the other ones that our team can answer, we will send the answers to those when we send the recording out. But John, this last one again is for you. Is it okay, listening to the accommodation descriptions, to ask unvaccinated employees to mask if they are the only people asked to wear masks, assuming all other factors of office size and distancing are applied to all employees? So if certain people decide not to vaccinate, can we require them to wear masks?
Well, I think you can require all employees to wear a mask, and I would probably err on the side of caution and actually have all employees. Let's assume you do have some employees that get vaccinated. That doesn't mean that they can't get the disease and that they can't spread it, because there's no definitive proof yet that the vaccine, while it may be effective in helping you fend off symptoms and helping keep you alive and not go on a ventilator, you could still spread it. And so I think an employer has a right to have the appropriate protocols. And so that you avoid discrimination claims, I would just have a policy that says we're all going to wear them out of an abundance of caution until we're sure we're through this. That would be my recommendation.
And that's a great reminder. It's such a great reminder too, that doesn't mean that you can just, because you may have been vaccinated, and I even heard somebody out when I had made a trip to the store the other day, even saying, no, I don't have to wear a mask now, I've already been vaccinated, or I've already had it, so I'm immune, right? So again, it's that education piece that is so important there, whether you've had it already and you have antibodies or you've been vaccinated.
Exactly.
So unfortunately, we are out of time. Again, these were great questions that came in. There was just a few that we didn't get to. A number of other specific questions, it seemed that the answers to them were rolled up into the ones that we did have time to get to today. As I mentioned, we will be sending out the recording to mention this a few times, along with my contact information there. If you would love to connect either with John or with Jody, or just learn more about either the legal side or resources for employees, as well as for organizations, please reach out. We would love to have some conversations with you. And in the next few days too, probably about a weekish or so too, you will hear about the next session that we're going to be holding in March. We hope to see all of you there. And again, hope that you found value out of today's session. And we want to thank all of you for making time in your day today for what we believe, and I believe that all of us here today see as a very, very important topic. And again, thank you for attending. John, thank you for your time, your expertise. Jody, thank you as well. And for everyone else, take care, stay well, stay safe, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.